His feet weren't feet anymore. They were raw, bleeding chunks of meat. Every step felt like walking on broken glass. Yossi Ginsberg was 22 years old, lost and completely alone in the deepest, unexplored part of the Bolivian Amazon. He hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks. He was skeletal. He collapsed onto the jungle floor. He was too weak to fight the insects already starting to feast on his rotting skin. He looked down and saw thousands of termites crawling onto his legs. They were treating him like a decomposing log. He accepted his fate. He was going to die here in the green hell, and no one would ever find his body. This nightmare didn't start with a plane crash or a shipwreck. It started with a handshake, a promise of hidden gold, untouched civilizations, and the adventure of a lifetime. It was a promise that led two men to vanish forever, and left Yossi trapped in a survival situation so extreme experts still can't believe he made it out alive. He survived a flood that turned the jungle into an ocean, fought off a jaguar with a can of bug spray, and endured his own body decomposing while he was still alive. But as the termites began to bury him, Yossi needed a miracle. And he needed it now. In 1981, Yossi Ginsberg had just finished 3 years of mandatory service in the Israeli Navy. He was restless. He didn't want a normal life, a desk job, a routine. He craved raw, unfiltered adventure, inspired by books like Papillon, the story of a survival in a brutal jungle prison. Yossi worked odd jobs across different continents, saving every dollar for one goal: to explore the Amazon rainforest and to go where the maps ended. He landed in La Paz, Bolivia, a city buzzing with backpackers. It was here that the fateful group came together. Yossi met Marcus Stamm, a gentle, quiet schoolteacher from Switzerland. Marcus was looking for an experience outside his comfort zone, and he wasn't an outdoorsman. He was kind, perhaps too kind for the Amazon. Soon after, they befriended Kevin Gale, an American wildlife photographer, rugged and intense, chasing the perfect shot. The three friends were eager for adventure, but they needed a guide. That's when Karl Ruprechter entered the picture. Karl was Austrian, older, charismatic, and radiated confidence. He looked like a real explorer. He approached Yossi on the street with a story that sounded too good to be true. Karl claimed he was a geologist who knew the location of a hidden indigenous tribe, the Taramonas, people who had never seen the outside world. And even better, he knew where to find a river loaded with gold. Karl told them, "This isn't for tourists. This is the real Amazon. I can take you there, but you have to be strong." Yossi was hooked. Gold and lost tribes, it was exactly what he came for. Marcus, however, was hesitant. He didn't trust Karl, but Yossi's enthusiasm was infectious. He persuaded Marcus to join. They trusted Karl. Why wouldn't they? He seemed completely legitimate. This was their first mistake, and it would prove fatal. The four men pooled their money to buy supplies, but right from the start, the red flags were there. Karl was secretive about the route. He wouldn't show them a detailed map. When local guides in La Paz warned them that Karl's plan was suicidal, that the area was unexplored, and the rainy season was approaching, Karl dismissed them as ignorant. He convinced the group that he alone held the key to the jungle's secrets. They set off, flying to the small jungle town of Apollo, and then started hiking toward the Tuichi River. The first week was exactly what they had dreamed of. The jungle was stunning. They felt like true explorers, hacking their way into the unknown. But the Amazon is not a paradise. It's a green hell. By the second week, the reality of their situation set in. The hiking was brutal. They were moving through dense vegetation for 10 hours a day. The humidity was suffocating, and they were running out of food much faster than expected. They had to start hunting. They managed to shoot wild monkeys with a small shotgun Karl had brought. Eating them was difficult, especially for Marcus. The sound of a monkey dying, Yossi realized, sounded terrifyingly human. They boiled the meat for hours, but it was tough and tasteless. But when you're starving, you eat anything. The dream started to sour. Tensions rose. The group realized that Carl, their expert guide, wasn't leading them anywhere. The gold never appeared. The tribes never appeared. They were just walking, starving, and lost. But the biggest problem was Marcus. He was struggling mentally and physically. His feet had become severely infected. He had trench foot. The skin was peeling off, exposing raw flesh. Every step was agony for him. He could barely walk. Marcus was slowing them down, and Carl had zero patience. Carl started bullying Marcus, calling him weak, telling him to toughen up or be left behind. Carl also started hoarding food, eating more than his share while the others starved. The group was fracturing. They were lost, starving, and one of them was seriously injured. They reached the Tuichi River. They decided to build a raft to float downriver to a supposed gold mining settlement. It seemed faster, and crucially, it would get Marcus off his feet. But the moment they started building the raft, the group dynamic shattered completely. Carl suddenly refused to get on the raft. The reason? He admitted he couldn't swim. They were planning to navigate a massive, dangerous river system, and their guide was terrified of water. Trust evaporated. The arguments became explosive. They couldn't continue as four. A drastic decision had to be made. They would split up. It was a desperate plan. Carl and Marcus would abandon the raft and try to walk back to civilization, following the riverbank. Carl claimed it would only take 3 days. Yossi and Kevin, who were stronger, would continue downriver on the raft. This decision seems insane. Splitting up in a survival situation is the #1 rule you do not break. But the group was desperate. They hated each other. They couldn't stand being together another minute. Yossi felt immense guilt about leaving Marcus, especially knowing that he was weak and relying on the untrustworthy Carl. But Marcus insisted. He didn't want to slow them down. The friends hugged, promising to meet back in La Paz for Christmas. Yossi and Kevin watched as Carl and Marcus disappeared into the dense jungle. It was the last time they were ever seen. Yossi and Kevin launched their raft onto the Tuichi River, and at first, it was a huge relief. No more hiking. They were moving fast. They thought the worst was over. They were wrong. The river became faster and more violent. They were approaching a notorious section of rapids and waterfalls known as the San Pedro Canyon. Kevin knew they needed to get to shore and walk around it, but they were moving too fast. The currents were just too strong. They tried paddling to the bank, but it was useless. The raft was sucked into the canyon. The noise was deafening. The raft slammed into the rocks, spinning out of control. They were paddling desperately, trying to keep the logs together. Then, disaster struck. The raft hit a massive exposed rock. The impact was explosive. The logs splintered. Yossi was thrown into the churning white water. He was sucked under, tumbling by the immense power of the river. He swallowed water, fighting for air, and when he finally surfaced, he grabbed onto a floating log. He looked around frantically. "Kevin!" he screamed. Kevin was clinging to the riverbank further upstream. He was alive, but the river was too fast. Yossi was being swept away, unable to swim towards his friend. Kevin scrambled along the bank, trying to keep up, shouting instructions, but Yossi was moving too fast. He rounded a bend in the river, and Kevin was gone. Yossi was alone. Truly, terrifyingly alone. He managed to drag himself onto the riverbank. He took stock of what he had. It was almost nothing. His main backpack was gone, but as he checked a small bag tied to his belt, he found something crucial. A lighter that had somehow stayed dry. It was his only lifeline. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was stranded in the middle of the Amazon. No one knew where he was. He had no food, no weapons, and no survival training for this environment. The silence of the jungle was overwhelming. It wasn't quiet. It was loud with the sounds of insects and animals. Sounds that, until now, had been background noise. Now, every snap of a twig was a potential threat. His first priority was finding Kevin. He started walking along the river, shouting his friend's name. He walked for 4 days, fueled by adrenaline and hope. He found Kevin's backpack, washed ashore, containing some mosquito repellent and a little more survival gear. But no Kevin. The hope of finding him faded, replaced by the cold reality of survival. Yossi decided to keep following the river. He believed the river was his only way out. Hunger became his constant companion, a gnawing pain in his stomach. He tried eating berries and fruit, but he didn't know what was safe. One day, he heard a rustling in the leaves above him. He climbed the trees, his body screaming in protest. Inside a nest, he found 2 eggs. He cracked them open and swallowed the raw contents, including the half-formed embryos inside. He nearly vomited, but it was protein. It was life. The nights were the worst. The jungle transformed into a terrifying landscape of shadows and sounds. One night, maybe 5 days in, he was huddled by a small fire. Suddenly, he heard a noise nearby, a low growl. He looked up and froze. 2 glowing eyes were staring at him from the darkness. It was a jaguar. A massive predator slowly approached him. Yossi was paralyzed with fear. He had no weapon. The jaguar was just a few feet away, sniffing the air. It could kill him in seconds. In a moment of desperate instinct, Yossi remembered the mosquito repellent from Kevin's backpack and the lighter in his pocket. He grabbed the can and the lighter, and he sprayed the repellent toward the jaguar and flicked the lighter. A massive fireball erupted between them, a makeshift flamethrower. The sudden explosion of light and sound terrified the jaguar. It roared and disappeared back into the jungle. Yossi collapsed, shaking uncontrollably. He realized how vulnerable he really was. He wasn't at the top of the food chain here. Here, he was prey. He knew he couldn't stay in one place. He had to keep moving. But the jungle fought back. The insects were relentless. He was covered in bites. He started noticing strange lumps moving under his skin. Botfly larvae. They had burrowed into his flesh. He had to painfully squeeze them out one by one, risking severe infection. But the most insidious threat wasn't the animals or the insects. It was his own body failing him. After 2 weeks, his feet started to rot, just like Marcus's. He developed severe trench foot. His boots were falling apart and his feet were constantly wet. The skin turned black and peeled away. The pain was so intense he couldn't walk. He would look down and see chunks of his own flesh just falling off. He described it later as pulling off socks made of his own flesh. He was physically deteriorating, but his mind was also starting to fracture. The isolation was crushing. He began to hallucinate. He heard voices calling his name. Then, the rain started. It wasn't just rain. It was a monsoon. The Amazon rainy season had arrived. The river started to rise rapidly. Yossi was hiking alongside the riverbank when he realized the entire area was flooding. The water was rising so fast that he had to climb a tree to escape it. He spent 2 days trapped in that tree. The entire jungle floor was submerged. He had nothing to eat, nothing to drink, and he just watched as the floodwaters carried away massive trees. If he had been on the ground, he would have drowned instantly. When the floodwaters finally receded, the landscape had completely changed. The jungle floor was covered in thick, slippery mud. Yossi was exhausted and weak. He slipped and fell into a bog. He started sinking into the mud. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank. The mud was up to his chest. He was trapped. He thought this was the end. He was going to be swallowed by the jungle. He closed his eyes. He relaxed his body and slowly, agonizingly, managed to pull himself out using an overhanging vine. He had survived the flood, but he was broken. He had been alone for nearly 3 weeks. He was skeletal. To cope with the overwhelming loneliness, his mind created a companion. He started hallucinating a woman. She appeared beside him, walking with him, talking to him. He knew she wasn't real, but she provided him with the comfort and motivation he needed to keep going. He did everything for him. She was his reason to live. And day 19, Yossi was near death. He couldn't walk anymore. His feet were destroyed. He collapsed on the jungle floor, ready to give up. This is when the ants found him. He was lying on what he thought were dry leaves, too weak to move. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain all over his body. He looked down and saw he was covered in thousands of fire ants. They were biting him everywhere. The pain was unbearable. It was the most agonizing torture he had experienced so far. He wanted to die, but the intense pain triggered something deep inside of him. A surge of adrenaline, a primal rage. He wasn't going to die like this. So he jumped up, screaming in agony, and started rolling on the ground, trying to crush the ants. He frantically swiped them off his body. The pain was excruciating, but it woke him up. It brought him back to reality. The hallucinated woman disappeared. He realized he was alone again, and he needed to save himself. So he forced himself to stand up and started walking again. Meanwhile, you might be asking, what happened to Kevin? Kevin had survived the Raft disaster. After Yossi disappeared around the bend, Kevin realized he couldn't follow him through the dangerous rapids. He waited for Yossi for days, hoping his friend would appear. When Yossi didn't show up, Kevin realized he had to get help. He continued down the river and, miraculously, within 5 days of the accident, was found by a group of local fishermen. They took him to the nearest settlement, Rurenabake, about 120 miles from where the accident happened. As soon as he arrived, Kevin started organizing a rescue mission. He begged the local authorities for help, but they refused. They said the jungle was just too dangerous and that Yossi was certainly dead. No one could survive alone for that long. Kevin refused to give up. He used his own money and convinced a local boatman named Tico to take him back up the river to search for Yossi. They searched for 3 days, navigating the treacherous river. They were running low on fuel, and Tico said that they had to turn back. The search just seemed hopeless. Kevin begged for 1 more hour, one last search of the river. Tico reluctantly agreed. Day 20 for Yossi. He was lying on the riverbank, barely conscious. This was the moment the termites found him, starting to crawl over his body. He was hallucinating again. He heard the sounds of a boat engine. He had heard this sound many times before in his hallucinations, so he ignored it. It wasn't real. But this time, the sound got louder. It was persistent. Yossi opened his eyes and looked at the river. There, he saw a boat. He couldn't believe it. He thought it was another hallucination. He was just too weak to stand up, too weak to shout. In the boat, Kevin was scanning the riverbanks. They rounded a bend, and Tico suddenly cut the engine. Then Kevin saw him, a skeletal figure lying on the riverbank, covered in mud and blood. He looked like a corpse. "Yossi!" Kevin screamed. Yossi heard his name. It was Kevin's voice, and it was real. He managed to lift his arm and wave. Tico steered the boat to the shore. Kevin jumped out and ran to Yossi. The reunion was emotional. Kevin couldn't believe the state Yossi was in. He had lost over 35 pounds. He was covered in infections, bites, and his feet were completely raw. Kevin held him, tears streaming down his face. "It's over, Yossi. We're going home," he said. They carefully carried Yossi to the boat and started the journey back to Rurenabake. Yossi was safe. He had survived 20 days alone in the uncharted Amazon. When they arrived, the entire town came out to see him. They called it a miracle. Yossi was immediately taken to the hospital. He spent 3 months recovering from his injuries and malnutrition. The doctors were amazed he hadn't developed any fatal infections. But the ordeal wasn't over. They still didn't know what happened to Marcus and Carl. While recovering, Yossi learned the truth about Carl Ruprechter. He wasn't a geologist or an explorer. He was an Austrian criminal wanted by Interpol. He lured backpackers into the jungle, likely to rob them or use them for some unknown scheme. The realization hit Yossi hard. He had trusted a dangerous criminal with his life and the lives of his friends. As soon as Yossi was strong enough, he organized search parties to find Marcus and Carl. They searched the area where they had split up, but they found nothing. No footprints, no abandoned supplies, nothing. It was as if the jungle had swallowed them whole. The mystery of what happened to them remains unsolved. Did Carl harm Marcus when Marcus became too weak to continue? Or did they both simply succumb to the brutal reality of the Amazon? Nobody knows. Yossi struggled with the guilt of leaving Marcus behind. He had convinced Marcus to join the expedition, and it cost him his life. Yossi Ginsberg's survival story is one of the most incredible tales of human endurance. After recovering, Yossi didn't run away from the jungle. Instead, he returned. He went back to the area where he was lost and worked with the local indigenous communities. He dedicated his life to protecting the Amazon, helping them establish an ecotourism lodge called Chalalan. The place that almost killed him became his sanctuary. You won't believe what the people in these next two stories did to survive. Click now to see what they did to stay alive, and ask yourself, could you do the same? Subscribe for more, and I'll see you soon.